Some people make history with greatness, others by dying ridiculously. Tycho Brahe. Tycho Brahe wasn't just any Renaissance scientist. He was the rock star of astronomy before telescopes even existed. Long before anyone had a spyglass pointed at the skies, Tycho was charting planets and stars with instruments so large and precise that they resembled medieval siege weapons. He discovered a new star, a supernova, that shattered the old belief in an unchanging universe and gathered the astronomical data that would later let Johannes Kepler rewrite the rules of the solar system. But while Tycho could outwit the mysteries of the stars, his downfall came from something far more earthly. In 1601, at a royal banquet in Prague, Tycho found himself in a social trap. At these ultra-formal dinners, walking away from the table before the host's signal wasn't just rude, it was scandalous. Such behavior could stain your reputation in court for years. Unfortunately, Tycho's bladder didn't care about etiquette. It filled and kept filling. Most of us would make the practical choice, excuse ourselves, risk a bit of gossip, and avoid internal rupture. But Tycho was not like most of us. This was a man so stubborn. He'd once fought a duel over who was the better mathematician. He lost part of his nose in the process, then strapped on a stylish brass prosthetic, like some kind of Renaissance cyborg. Instead of excusing himself like a sane person, Tycho decided he would simply endure. He sat there, regal and polite, while inside his body a urinary apocalypse was brewing. Hour after hour passed. Wine flowed freely, courses piled up, and Tycho kept his bladder clenched with the grim determination of a man defending a fortress. By the time the feast finally ended, the damage was done. Whether it was a rupture, an infection, or some catastrophic combination, the result was the same. Within 11 days, the great astronomer was dead. Spent his life tracking planetary motions, but couldn't track the nearest restroom. John Sedgwick. Union General John Sedgwick was no lightweight. By all accounts, he was one of the Union's solid commanders, brave, competent, respected by his men, and the kind of officer who actually stood up front instead of barking orders from a safe distance, and earned his soldiers' loyalty the hard way. But at the Battle of Spotsylvania Courthouse in Virginia, Sedgwick decided to test not just the limits of his men's nerves, but also the patience and aim of Confederate sharpshooters. The enemy snipers were a good 1,000 yards out, and while Civil War rifles could theoretically hit something at that range, the odds were low. Still, bullets were zipping by, and Sedgwick's soldiers were doing the smart thing, ducking. Sedgwick, however, thought this was the perfect teaching moment. He stood tall, in plain sight, while his men huddled for cover, and delivered what would become one of the most tragically famous lines in American military history. "They couldn't hit an elephant at this distance." He'd shouted into the void, and the void was definitely listening. And then, because the universe has impeccable comedic timing, a Confederate sharpshooter put a bullet straight into his face, just under the left eye. Sedgwick dropped dead on the spot instantly. Years of campaigns, countless battles, a career of proven courage, all erased in the span of a sentence and a single shot. The Confederates didn't need to hit an elephant. A general with a big mouth made for a much easier target. His men learned two things that day. One, always keep your head down. And two, never let your commanding officer start doing stand-up comedy within rifle range. Mithridates VI. Mithridates wasn't just another ancient king. He was the ancient world's ultimate prepper, a paranoid survivalist centuries before bunkers and bug-out bags were a thing. But unlike your eccentric neighbor who hoards canned beans for the apocalypse, Mithridates had good reason to be wary. Everyone really was trying to kill him. As the ruler of Pontus, he spent most of his life as a thorn in Rome's side, defying their legions and keeping his kingdom alive against overwhelming odds. His greatest obsession? Poison. In an age where backstabbing wasn't just a metaphor, assassination by poison was a professional hazard for rulers. So Mithridates turned paranoia into science. Every day, he'd dose himself with just enough toxins to make his stomach churn, but not enough to drop dead, slowly forging a body that treated poison like an afternoon snack. He built up such resistance that his personal brew, Mithridatium, became legendary as a universal antidote For decades, this bizarre regimen had been effective. Assassins failed, plots unraveled, and Rome's best generals, including the great Sulla, spent years trying to break him. But then, cornered at last in 63 BC with no way out, Mithridates decided to go out on his own terms. No parades for the Romans, no humiliating chains in a triumph through the streets of Rome. He would take the noble exit, suicide by poison. Except there was one small problem. After a lifetime of carefully training his body to resist toxins, the fatal dose he swallowed barely tickled him. With poison useless against the man who had lived and breathed it, Mithridates had no choice but to ask a loyal servant to finish the job with a blade. His paranoia had saved him countless times, until the day it betrayed him. Grigori Rasputin. Oh, Rasputin. Where do we even start with this guy? He wasn't a monk, he wasn't exactly a doctor, and he smelled like a walking scandal. But somehow this ill-kempt Siberian mystic wormed his way into the confidence of the Romanovs and became the one weird person everyone in the Russian court resented but couldn't dislodge. By 1916, aristocrats were convinced Rasputin wasn't just bad taste, he was a political virus. Something had to be done. Enter Prince Felix Yusupov and a coalition of nobles who thought assassination would be a tidy little civic duty. Invite the man to a palace, slip him some poison-laced treats, and presto, problem solved. They baked cyanide into cakes and spiked the wine with enough poison to down a draft horse. It should have been straightforward. Instead, it turned into a live-action horror comedy. Rasputin ate, drank, and chatted, apparently impervious to the cocktail of death on his plate. The cyanide did what cyanide does to mere mortals, which is to say, didn't do a thing to him. The conspirators watched in growing confusion as their carefully administered villain removal appeared to fizzle. Panic replaced patience. Yusupov, losing his composure, pulled a pistol and put a round into Rasputin's chest at point-blank range. For a glorious, terrifying second, it looked like the job was done. The conspirators relaxed, went upstairs to scheme about disposal, and then returned to check the corpse. And that's when Rasputin, eyes popping open, grabbed Yusupov by the throat. He staggered madly into the courtyard, like something out of a nightmare. The nobles opened fire again, emptying several more shots into him. Still not safe. They beat him, they bludgeoned him, they wrapped him in a carpet, and hurled him into the freezing Neva. When the body was pulled out days later, the autopsy showed water in his lungs. Poisoned, shot multiple times, beaten senseless, and still alive long enough to drown. Sometimes the hardest part of assassination isn't the planning. It's making sure your target has the basic courtesy to actually die when you kill them. Jack Daniel. Founder of one of America's most famous whiskey brands, Jack Daniel was a man who built an empire out of Tennessee limestone spring water, charred oak barrels, and the simple belief that whiskey could smooth out life's rough edges. He was a shrewd businessman, a legendary distiller, and the kind of guy who made sure his name would outlive him on millions of bottles worldwide. If anyone seemed destined to enjoy a long, whiskey-soaked retirement, it was Jack. But for all his savvy in business and mastery of mash bills, Jack was less skilled in the areas of math, patience, and anger management. One early morning, he showed up at his office, ready to start the day, only to realize he'd forgotten the combination to his safe. Now, most people would sigh, maybe wait for someone else to arrive, or, heaven forbid, write the combination down somewhere. Jack, however, decided this was a matter of personal pride. The safe had mocked him, and he wasn't going to let it win. So, Jack hauled off and kicked the safe hard. The safe, being made of solid metal and utterly indifferent to human tantrums, didn't budge. Jack's foot, on the other hand, did. He broke his toe, which in the pre-antibiotic era was basically a golden ticket to a slow, ugly death. The injury became infected, the infection spread, and eventually doctors amputated his leg, but by then, it was too late. Sepsis finished what the safe had started. The man whose whiskey was designed to help people relax and take life less seriously died because he couldn't take a deep breath, pour himself a drink, and not karate kick heavy steel machinery before breakfast. Emperor Valentinian I. Rome had seen plenty of emperors who were incompetent, insane, or just plain unlucky, but Valentinian wasn't one of them. He could actually run an empire without setting it on fire, but Valentinian had one fatal flaw, a volcanic temper that could make Mount Vesuvius look like a mild steam vent. Being in the room when Valentinian lost it was basically like standing next to a human thunderstorm. You just prayed he didn't decide to direct the lightning at you. One day, a group of Quadi envoys arrived to discuss grievances with the empire. Normally, this kind of diplomatic meeting would involve polite words, some negotiation, maybe a ceremonial gift exchange, but these poor Quadi must have said something too demanding, too disrespectful, or maybe just not flattering enough, because Valentinian detonated. His face went purple, the veins in his neck pulsed like hydraulic pumps, and he unleashed what eyewitnesses later described as the angriest rant of his entire career. He shouted so violently, so ferociously, that his body simply tapped out. In the middle of his tirade, Valentinian collapsed, felled not by an assassin's blade or a barbarian's spear, but by his own blood pressure, a fatal stroke brought on by what can only be described as history's deadliest temper tantrum. Imagine the Quadi delegation standing there wide-eyed and wondering, wait, did we just argue the Emperor of Rome to death? Do we still get our treaty? Or... Hope you enjoyed it. Until next time.